Also, hopefully you've already noted in the conference program, we have two keynotes today, which is particularly special. The first by Ambassador Fabrizi, who I'll introduce just now, who will open proceedings. And at the end of today at 5 o'clock, the former member of the European Parliament, Baroness Nicholson, will close with a keynote.
Most of us could be happy of having one honorary doctorate. At least certainly will be my experience. Lady Nicholson has 8 of them, so I think it's an impressive from that point of view. And in the spare time, she already wrote 3 books. So with this fascinating career and spanning continents, interests, and sector, we very much look forward to listening for you with your experience. I personally cherish the British Lib Dem credential, and certainly a great contribution to the European cause. So, without further ado, Lady Nicholson, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you all very much indeed for your kind welcome, and I particularly thank the Ambassador for his hard work and amazing achievements in this part of the world for the European Union, and also Professor Martin Holland, great man, most clearly, who's dedicated himself to enlightening everyone on the European Union and to enhancing its benefits. All of the speakers of today that I've heard have been absolutely fascinating. I've rather enjoyed sitting at the back of the hall, listening to the British government being heavily pounded. I didn't like to say that I'm actually a member of the British government. It was rather good of me. So very peaceful and all the rest of it. But I've learned a great deal, and I'm most grateful to everyone. I mean, Philomena, I don't know where she is, has been fantastically active today, and you've drawn all sorts of people into the panels that you've been leading, and I've learned a very great deal. A lot of rich material has come through, and it's very clear that people do a great deal of research before they put their doctorates and their theses in front of the audiences, and I'm looking forward to tomorrow as well. The remarks I'm going to make are perhaps, first of all, on the great strength of the European Union, which from the political point of view, I would suggest are its soft power. Everybody, almost everybody I've ever met in the last 10 or 20 years has felt very warmly towards the European Union, has not felt aggressed by the European Union, has not felt dominated by the European Union, has not felt invaded in any shape or form by the European Union, but on the other hand, has had a tremendous admiration for the European Union, has perhaps a very great deal of admiration and a great deal of respect. In a sense, has looked upon the EU as a unique and very special friend. And I found that absolutely everywhere. And as the Ambassador has said, I have wandered around quite a lot in the globe promoting democracy. And it's a very rare, I would suggest, a unique attitude of different sorts of civilizations and cultures and people towards the European Union. I don't think that attitude has ever been experienced so universally towards any political cluster of countries or individual nations before. And that, I think, is what I'm calling soft power, a rather dull term really, for something much more special than soft power. And I want to talk a little bit about that and about the way in which Parliament, the European Parliament particularly, has tools at its disposal, and how, when I was there, we've used them and how they're continuing to be used, which promote that soft power. And then I want to comment a little bit on the challenges we're facing at the moment, which are quite dramatic, quite large, and really in some ways quite scary. And to remind ourselves as to the purpose of the European Parliament at all, first of all, do remember that the European Parliament is a very, very different animal from the animal that was first created. If you look back at the original records, you will recall that the European Parliament was only going to meet once a year. And it was only going to put a little bit of gold plating on the decisions that the Council of Ministers, who wouldn't be making many decisions, would have made throughout that year. There was no question of the European Parliament passing legislation. Indeed, when there was a big debate in Britain on whether or not Britain should apply to join, I think in the 1960s or something, one of my uncles, who was Lord Chancellor at the time, informed the Cabinet, and it's in the Cabinet papers, that the European Parliament was never going to pass any legislation at all, and the odd bit of legislation it might pass would be junior to national legislation anyway. How wrong he proved, and yet that thinking I still found in the ministries in London when I first became a Member of Parliament in the House of Commons in 1987, the belief that European law was subsidiary to national law. And today, as the Ambassador said this morning, 60 to 70% of everybody's legislation is derived from Brussels and comes through Brussels. A very, very different scenario, therefore, for the Parliament from its origins when Brussels began. So we have a different animal, and it is pouring out legislation at the rate of knots. And what's the purpose of the European Parliament is to bridge the so-called democratic deficit. It's hard to see that it does that, however, and I leave this with you as a thought, when we have this minuscule vote. Speaking personally as a politician, anything less than 50% of the vote is not democracy. And we have these tiny votes, not just in the UK, but throughout many countries in the European Union. And if we can't address that, then we're going to have a real permanent, complete problem. And that may bring the House of Europe down faster than almost anything else. Because today's electorate is very different from the days when the European Parliament began. Even when the British Parliament in the last 100 years or so, today's electorate is fully knowledgeable. No longer is the Member of Parliament the knowledgeable person who passes on the knowledge and explains the knowledge to you. I mean, the wonderful thing is that people today are fully briefed, fully up to speed. They're more than capable of making their own decisions. So it is a different world for politicians. It is a different electorate. And therefore, the minuscule vote that the European Parliament collects is deeply troubling for anybody who's ever been elected. And I worry very much indeed that the European Commission and even the Council of Ministers in their bubble don't quite grasp the enormity of that challenge. The electorate will turn its back very quickly these days on something that it doesn't actually respect and like. We see this in Britain in politics, where members of the House of Commons are now lower even than estate agents and lower than the press, who are usually the lowest of the low. And to get below the press and estate agents is really some achievement.